So we need a new way of talking about, thinking about, and then addressing what we call addiction. First, I want to talk about the ways we tend to think of that. Addiction historically tends to be associated and defined by a certain attachment to a behavior, a substance, an activity, some type of situation where it's habitual. Somebody has trouble not doing it. It gets repetitive and has negative impact upon their lives, starts to compromise their functional living in some way or the other. I think that we need a different way and a more nuanced way of looking at how we define it, because it isn't just about a difference in philosophy about it. It changes how we're going to address things in some very key ways. The biggest difference is that we need a distinction between addiction and the channel, meaning the drive that's there and the particular, say, drug of choice, the behavior of choice, whether that's drinking, that's drugs, that's spending money. There's a lot of debate about what should be labeled an addiction and what shouldn't. And this is part of the difficulty, is when we are defining it in neurologic terms, in terms of what parts of the brain for reward centers lights up or not, it gets tangled up in defining it by the channel through which the addiction is taking place. So I want to look at addiction as a different concept than that. That I want to look at addiction as our misguided attempt to address a very sacred need. We have a need for feeling better. You'll hear me talk about that a lot. We have a need for energy and connection. We need to feel good. We need to feel connected. We need to feel loved and safe and supported. That's our drive. That's the core drive. Addiction is simply when we are meeting that or attempting to meet those needs in a way that just simply doesn't work very well. If I give you a blueprint for building a house and there's a pile of nails and a pile of boards and a screwdriver. Somebody start working on this and they get to the part where they got to nail something together, and you got a nail and you got the board and then you got a screwdriver and all right, how's this going to work? You might resort to all kinds of kind of other methodologies. Oh, maybe if I hold the screwdriver backwards and I can bang on the nail with the back of the screwdriver, maybe that could work. We might really pound really, really hard and do it enough to get the nail in a little bit even. And then sooner or later, we've got something kind of half constructed and it keeps falling apart. If somebody just comes along one day and hands that person a hammer, this works. Okay. And now we can build a house. And then a whole functional house gets constructed through nothing more than having the right tool to address the challenge. Our challenge is to feel better. Our challenge is to meet that energy and connection need every day. When we're using a tool that doesn't work very well, then things just keep falling apart. So there's a difference between the drive, which is a sacred drive. It is coming from a good place. It's not coming from a demonic place inside us that's trying to take us over, control our lives, wreck our lives. And I hear a lot of that kind of talk within the addiction community and addiction world, as well as its definitions in the mental health field. It's seen as a destructive force that's operating. No, it's not a destructive force. It's actually a very sacred drive that needs to be honored, and we need to focus more on what are other ways we can actually do things. When our basic needs are not being met in a healthy way, when we don't have life experiences where that type of self-connection, first and foremost, being able to be at home in our own bodies, be able to to feel deeply loved and supported and engage in a healthy way with our environment and our support structures, when that isn't present, especially in our early years, and those options are off the table, it means that our primary way of addressing the core job isn't available. It's simply not an option. So what do? I start finding something like a screwdriver when I need a hammer. We start moving instinctively toward some way to try to remedy the pain, some way to remedy the tension, the discomfort, the core driving need that something just doesn't feel right, and there's that river of worry underneath life that we're trying to address and find a way to fix. That's always operating. The question is, how am I addressing it? When I'm having to pick other things that I have found along the way, drugs, alcohol, sex, money, stuff, eating, we have a whole laundry list of ways in which we are actually simply trying to make ourselves feel better, but it doesn't really hit the target. All addictive channels have basically the same endpoint. It kind of makes things a little bit better, but not the right kind of better. It's kind of a fake better, and that's very temporary. And then once that thing is gone, then there's a crash again, and there's some kind of a hangover effect. If it's drugs or alcohol, we get a hangover. If it's being a workaholic, it may be wrecking our home life and our relationships. If we spend too much money, we're watching the bank account continually get drained. So there's negative consequence to every addictive channel that we choose to address our core sacred need. That's what they all have in common. If we can look at things this way, then it changes what we want to focus on. Because in the old model, in most of the current model, when it is all about the channel and addiction is defined by a certain chosen channel, then first of all, sobriety really becomes the primary endpoint treatment. That's the definition of addiction. So if I am no longer using that particular channel, I'm in recovery from addiction. It gets defined solely by the behavior. Recovery is a totally different treatment and a whole different way of addressing things if we're looking at addressing the sacred drive. When that becomes the focus of our recovery process, then all of a sudden, the other stuff gets naturally better in a much more organic way, and it's long-lasting, and we're actually hitting the target of what's wrong. My mentor, Dan Jones, used to say, and he'd had a history of many different types of addictive channels in his life early on. And he said, I never gave up anything of any of my addictive behaviors because it was the moral thing to do, or or something along those lines. He said, I just found a better drug. Love is a better drug. And he means by that solid, deep, unconditional, loving support, not the things that tend to go by the definition of love in our media and TV world, for instance. But deep, loving connection, first with self and then with the world around us. That is what we are after. Once we start to taste that more, once that gets fed, then other addictive drives, the things we would tend to go toward to feel better, just start to become less interesting. Because they're not as good. They were only there to try to be a poor substitute for what we're really after. When we start getting what we're really after, we start to naturally want and need less of the old channel. That's one of the profound emphases and positives about any kind of support group, whether it's a 12-step orientation or other types of ways of addressing pain with addiction, is that experience with other human beings in a healthier, more loving, supportive way starts to allow us to let go and set boundaries with our addictive behavior and change what we're doing and find what we're after. So what about some of the other ways of looking at addiction that tend to be popular? One of the newest is looking at the brain in addictive states. I just saw a video and a presentation on this recently where the overall theme was addiction is a brain disease. Here's the problem with it. There is all kinds of validity to looking at what different parts of our brain light up in certain types of activities. But that's different than seeing source of the problem. So we're watching in a neurological mapping. We are watching the wiring. We're watching a way in which a certain thing plays out in the wiring of the brain. That is different than looking at the actual source of the issue. So the problem with the neurologic perspective on this, in that way that it's presented, is that it limits the entire definition of addiction to something that lights up that pathway. That's why often there's arguments about other types of behaviors and whether or not they're addictions or not, is it becomes defined as something that lights up a certain type of reward center, for instance, in the brain, and becomes something habitual in terms of how that fires over and over again. That has validity, but it's valid as describing the channel and what a certain channel looks like. That's different than the driver. And so when our focus for therapy becomes exclusively about how we are addressing the molecular banging around in the brain, then we're missing the deeper drive that leads to all addictive types of seeking. Yes, are there issues with the repetitive stimulation of certain types of receptors and how that gets habituated, and then that creates its own craving, and that can be significantly more potent with certain substances, usually we're talking about substances, than others? Yes, but these are all the micro ways in which certain addictive channels play out and differ from one another. That's a completely different thing than the drive that we have that promotes the entire process. Genetics is another question. What about the studies that show that there's a genetic tendency toward a certain type of addiction? Yes, that's very real, because we're still talking about the addictive channel of choice. There's adequate data that somebody, for instance, who grows up with an alcoholic father has a much higher probability of becoming an alcoholic. It's not a guarantee. It doesn't force that situation. But all it means is my genetics tend to prefer a certain drug of choice. That drug of choice hits my system in a way that really becomes desirable. And so as my addictive drive through life is beginning to search for an answer to the river of pain inside, then it's going to tend to gravitate toward what my physical body gets the most pleasure out of. And yeah, that's going to have genetic tendencies. But that's still different. We're still talking about the channel, not the drive. And that is the key thing, the key things that have to be distinguished, I think, to properly address this in the long-term arc and help it not be simply about stopping certain behaviors or going toward a drug that will simply cut off or alter a certain pathway in our central nervous system so that that particular drug is less desirable than it was before. That could be beneficial. It could be good as an adjunct. That's different than the idea, trapping ourselves in the idea that we're actually hitting the primary source. So I think these things are helpful, but the context and how we're envisioning the whole is incredibly important and qualitatively different. The other big thing about this is, to me, it needs a redefining of who's an addict. To me, addiction is the human condition. We are all addicts. We are all trying to soothe our pain in so many different ways that simply don't work as a poor substitute for what we really want. However, lots of times we may be choosing different avenues that are much more socially sanctioned than others. Most of what ends up being labeled as an addiction is simply the ways that have been determined by society not to be acceptable. If you're a drug addict, if you're an alcoholic, that's not cool. That is something that definitely goes into the pile of an addiction. If you're a workaholic and you are rising up the ladder of corporate America, and you are now getting more and more money and you may get all kinds of rewards from society for your addictive behavior. It's not going to get labeled much of an addiction when society says it's wonderful and rewards us for it. So the real distinction to me is not so much about what types of neurologic pathways are getting chemically engaged. It's about the fact that we are all simply trying to meet this core soul need, and we have a plethora of ways in which we do that don't really work very well. So this model of addiction brings us all into the same group and the same camp together. That has a lot of benefits to me because we stop segregating society in this arena anyway of discussion, into non-addicts and addicts. There's the addicts and then there's everybody else who's normal. This is a big mistake, and it renders those that we have labeled as addicts with this big, scarlet letter on them that puts them in a category of, they've got a problem. I don't have that problem because that's not my particular methodologies for my addictive drive. So it allows us to create this false separation and split that makes it much more difficult for things to heal because there's a demonization of that category of human beings. Or at least saying, well, poor things, they need some help. We all need this help. We all have old trauma. We all have old pain, and we're all, most of the time, so much of the time, choosing methodologies to make it better that don't really actually hit the target. Now, all of us being in the same group like that is a challenge for both camps, actually, because it's a challenge for everybody in society to begin to really examine what they have called normal and to think about whether or not that's actually what's going on inside, and that they might actually have their own addictive channels to address their needs to feel better. It just may not be as obvious to everybody. On the other side, there frankly there's a little bit of identification as an addict that can create some bonding, but if it's in contradistinction to those who don't have any kind of addiction like I do, then that also creates a false dichotomy and a false distinction. So I think it's a little bit of a challenge for both camps to begin to embrace the possibility that we're all in the same boat together. It changes, too, like we've been talking about, how we address things. Yes, is sobriety a goal, especially depending on what type of channel we're talking about? Because some are simply more dangerous than others. If I'm an alcoholic, then getting behind the wheel of a car is a big problem. If I'm addicted to potato chips, the car's probably not as big a deal, and I'm probably not going to kill somebody with it. So there are effects that vary widely depending on the channel we're talking about. So sobriety from that particular channel is an important aspect of the recovery process, and sometimes very, very important from the get-go. But that's not the healing of addiction. The treatment and healing of addiction is about the deeper recovery process of addressing actually addiction, which is our need to feel better, simply taking the route of bad tools. One of the most essential elements in our healing process from addiction, then, is getting away from the demonization of the addiction, the demonization of the part of us that is going toward this behavior, this engagement. It unfortunately is still highly prevalent within addiction recovery circles and that realm of therapeutics, that there is a constant sense of this is a bad part of me, this is a thing that is trying to hurt me, as I have mentioned. That reparation of our relationship to that part of us is absolutely essential to our long-term peace and getting what we're actually needing. If what we are needing is to feel loved and safe and supported and find the good feeling inside that we have been after, for which the addictive channel has been a poor substitute, then we are preventing our access to that very goal as long as there is a piece of us that we hate. If this is a part of me that's trying to kill me, and I hate it, and I wish it would stop, and I'm constantly in a war and a battle inside, then there is no way to get to the ultimate drug of choice, feeling loved and supported and connected. because we've just already disconnected from self, and we are exacerbating that disconnection. We're continually recreating that. So one of the things that we have got to address very well in addiction recovery is an embracing of the source that this is coming from, that is not a bad part of us. It's an ailing part. It's a place that is in pain, that is needing loving validation and attention. Without that, we cannot get to the actual ultimate solution that allows us to feel better and begin to let go of addictive channels much more easily and move toward the betterment that we are seeking.